You know, if you ask most people to describe Christmas, most people will talk about joy, they'll talk about family and presents and even Christmas trees, right? But nobody relates to the story of Christmas as a story of a terrified king who lost his mind. Many people actually don't talk about that, and yet that's exactly what Matthew talks about this morning as we're going to look into Matthew chapter 2. You know, while heaven is celebrating with angels singing and the birth of the Savior on Christmas morning, and shepherds traveling long distances to worship this rightful king, there's another scene that starts to unfold at the same time of this beautiful angelic scene. It's a king who is trembling with utter fear. His name is actually Herod, and we're going to talk about him today. And Herod is proof that something psychologists tell us all the time. It's this, that fear doesn't just sit quietly in our hearts. Fear is actually so destructive, it grows its own pair of legs. And fear makes us make irrational decisions. And fear takes action that it makes us take these actions that we ultimately regret. And so Herod's actions shows us how dangerous it is to live a life full of fear. But right next to Herod, in the same chapter, is juxtaposed with this story of three magi responding to the same news that Herod received, but they respond in a completely different manner. They don't operate in fear. As a matter of fact, they do the opposite and they operate in faith. They don't cling on to control like Herod tries to, but in the opposite, they actually follow God's guidance for their lives. And here's the whole sermon in this one statement. Herod shows us what fear produces, while the Magi shows us what faith produces. And every single one of us must choose which path we will live by. And so let's take a look at the story in Matthew chapter 2. I've titled my sermon, A King's Fear. And in chapter 2, verses 1, we're going to see these words written. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. I want to focus on this word disturbed for just a quick second. The word disturbed in the Greek actually means shaken to the core. Like fear that is so debilitating that it shakes you to your very core. In other words, Herod is terrified. He's so terrified that we're going to see that he begins to lie, and then that lie turns into actual murder. And he's terrified enough to try to stop Christmas from ever happening in the history books. So let's take a look closely at two different reactions to this same story. In verses, if we go down further in verse 7, this is what Herod does. Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." This is the first response we see of Herod in his fear. as a result of his fear. In verse 7, he's calling the Magi secretly and tells the Magi in verse 8 these words, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." This is the Bible's polite way of saying King Herod was lying through his teeth. He was lying. Fear made him actually fake worship. He tells the Magi, yeah, I want to know where this king is born so that I can worship him. And fear made him fake humility, his own humility. And ultimately, fear made Herod fake spirituality, his own spirituality. But before we are quick to judge Herod this morning, I want to turn the question to ourselves by asking all of us, how often does fear make us react irrationally? Have you ever been in a place where you are fearful for something, and you ever notice that when you're gripped by fear, you oftentimes react very irrationally? We say things like, you know what, God, I trust you. But fear makes us panic in the inside. When we're asked how we're doing by a friend of ours, hey, how you doing? Many of us go into auto response mode by saying things like, by responding, oh, I'm fine. I'm doing fine. But deep down inside, there's this nagging fear in your heart that tells you the truth. You're not fine. Everything is a mess around you. Your life is topsy-turvy. And some of us may even listen to the Christian radio station on our way to work, and we hear lyrics like, Jesus, take the wheel, right? But yet fear keeps us, instead of lifting the steering wheel, by the way, don't do that while you're driving. But we always say, yeah, Jesus, take the wheel, but we always have one hand on the steering column, don't we? Or maybe a pinky. If we want to say, we want to act spiritual. And like Herod, fear makes people lie to themselves and pretend with God. How many times do we pretend like things are okay? And we lie to others, especially our loved ones, when things are not okay on the inside, because we're gripped with fear. We don't want to be found out. We don't want this imposter syndrome in our lives. And that's why many times fear makes us do irrational things like lying. And so before we go and judge Herod for his reactions to fear, I'd like for us to take a look at how do you and I respond to fear. And many times I think you and I, if we're very honest enough, you'll see that we respond very irrationally many times when we're living in fear. The second response is actually towards destruction. It's not only that fear makes Herod lie, but fear drives him towards utter destruction and out of control actions. Let's take a look in Matthew chapter 2, verse 16. A little further down, this is how Herod responds. Verse 16. When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Verse 16 says and uses the word that he was furious, that Herod was furious. This term is like this uncontrollable rage. Now, I trust that many of you have never had uncontrollable rage, but if you've ever seen or have friends that have uncontrollable rage, you know what this looks like. You know what this looks like. It's pretty devastating. And if you've ever heard the term turning red, it's like, or seeing red, that's all they could see. When someone is in a terrible rage, like verse 16 is describing, it's like all he's seeing is red. And fear takes Herod from lying in the beginning to now rage, this uncontrollable rage. And that uncontrollable rage actually now turns into ultimately murder. Murder. And I think if you follow along those tracks, that's usually what happens with people with uncontrollable rage. They are looking to kill something. Maybe not someone, but they're looking to utterly destroy everything in their path. Now, we hear that and we think, I could never do something like that. That's not me. I'm not Herod. Now, of course, we're not. But that pattern is the same in everyday life. Think about fear that is utterly destructive. Like that terrible fear. You know what it destroys? It destroys marriages. Talk to any person who's been abused, man or woman. It doesn't, it goes both ways. It's not just men who abuse women in marriages. It's also women who abuse men. Think about all those marriages that are under uncontrollable, a spouse, a partner who is under uncontrollable anger. It totally destroys marriages. Totally destroys marriages. Fear and uncontrollable anger breaks relationships. I used to have a friend, back at NYU when I went to college. He was the nicest guy. But once he got drunk, it was like night and day. I mean, we're talking flipping tables, fighting with security guards. I mean, so many times. One time we were in this party together, and he got so enraged that he got into a fight with a bunch of guys, and those guys pulled out a knife on us. And I still remember that night. I mean, it shakes me to the core when you have uncontrollable rage like that. That kind of rage also causes self-sabotage in our lives. People who are constantly in rage, they don't understand many times why many times they're alone. I mean, we from the outside perspective can see that and say, well, that's you, man. That's your fault. But they don't see it. They don't see the self-sabotage. And it's always, why are people leaving me? Why am I so alone? Why am I so lonely? Why do I have no friends? It's because they have this uncontrollable rage. This kind of rage makes us isolated. And I mean, there's so many things that I could tell you about that psychologists tell us that people with this uncontrollable rage have a myriad of problems. And Herod here is the extreme version of what fear happens, what fear does when it goes unchecked. When there's no checks and balances, when there's nobody in Herod's life to tell him, yo, you got to slow down here. Because what ends up happening is he ends up killing all of the babies, all of the males that are under 2, not only in Bethlehem, but in all the towns and the vicinities around there. He is so enraged that he kills, we don't know how many kids it was, because there wasn't a census back then. But we can imagine thousands and thousands of babies murdered because of one man's anger. And this is why psychologists tell us and experts share with us that fear, there are 3 things that happen with fear. Number 1, fear distorts our reality. You stop seeing clearly. And I don't know if you've ever tried to talk to someone who's living in utter fear or in a rage of anger, but there's no talking sense because it's like their brain is not functioning properly. And then the second thing that psychologists point out that fear does to people is it amplifies the threat around you. Everything and everyone around you feels dangerous. That's why they're always nervous about, they're living in fear, like, oh my gosh, who's out to get me? Who's going to do this? What word is going to come out of my spouse's mouth, in a fit of rage of anger? And number 3, fear produces this survival behavior. You react. You don't think. You act first instead of thinking. And that's what Herod does. He acts first. He doesn't even think about the repercussions of killing all these babies in the time of Jesus' birth. And Herod shows all 3 of these examples in today's passage. And Herod hears the words, "A baby is born." A baby is born, and he interprets that as a threat to him, as something that he needs to extinguish. A baby that was born. He sees that as a threat. And so here is the sobering truth I want us to get out of this, is if we do not surrender our fears to God, fear will take control of us. If we don't learn how to surrender our fears to God, fear will ultimately take control of us. And when fear takes control, a path of destruction always follows in and all around us. It's a path of destruction. But here's the juxtaposition in Matthew chapter 2. In verse 10, it says, when the Magi saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him, the baby. They opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. These men traveled hundreds of miles to be where Jesus was. They didn't know the whole story. It wasn't like God told them, hey, all this is happening. All he said was follow the star. That's all he said. They didn't know who Jesus was going to grow up to be. And they didn't have the New Testament like you and I do. They didn't have the traditions of Israel guiding their life. All they had was a simple star. That's all they had. And they had this stirring in their spirit of God telling them to follow that star. And so what did they do? They followed. They obeyed God's voice. And faith here is not about knowing everything. That's the thing, that's the irony about God, isn't it? Like he expects us, he asks us to walk in faith, but he doesn't tell us where that destination is going to look like. That's the difficulty of faith. But these men, these Magi, they're moving towards what God is telling them to do without knowing the repercussions of their actions. And in verse 11, look at what it says in verse 11. They bowed down and worshiped him. You see the juxtaposition here of these tale of 2 kings? Herod wanted to stay on his throne. But the Magi got off their own personal thrones to worship this baby. Herod clutched onto power, but the Magi surrendered their power. Herod lied about worshiping God. The Magi actually meet this baby, and in true worship, they worship him. Because Herod is the one giving orders, But the Magi are the one giving gifts. They gave to this baby Jesus gold, frankincense, and myrrh. I don't joke, but I did think this week, I wonder how many ounces of gold that was, because in today's society, if back then it was like $1 for an ounce of gold, well, today it's like $4,000, right? It's like it blew up. But anyway, I know that's just, sorry about that. Lord, forgive me for my evil thoughts while preparing this sermon. No, but this is what I want to say to us all. Fear closes your hands and makes you clench things tightly. Like you can't let go. But faith actually opens our hands to live loosely. Think about this for a moment. Notice that Herod did everything in his power to keep his wealth, to keep his kingdom, to keep his influence. But the Magi, they gave their wealth away. That's the difference between faith and fear. Fear makes you grip things so tight, you can't let it go. Faith is knowing and having the wisdom to let things go and say, God, I give you this. I give you these tithes and offerings. I give you these gifts to these children. All these things, faith makes us live with hands loosely. And there's a huge difference between fear and faith when it comes to giving. And I'll tell you, one indication of someone who's living in utter fear is they do not know how to give. They can't. They could have all the money in the world, but they don't know how to let it go. But those who live in faith, they give freely. And it says even in the Psalms and in the Proverbs that he who gives freely, God blesses even more so that they can give even more freely. You see how this is like it's a loop. And those who live in fear live in a constant loop of gripping tight and not letting go, versus those who live in faith, who's able to live with giving away, and they're even blessed even more. Finally, just want to finish our scripture section with verse 12. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Look at that, everyone. These Magi heard the voice of God. They've been warned by an angel in a dream, and they obeyed God in the face of death. Because back at this time, to actually disobey the king's orders was punishable by death. These Magi, they were told to return and report to Herod, but they don't do that. They actually disobey the governing authorities to obey God's voice. Not later, not when it's convenient, not after seeking a third or a fourth opinion, but these Magi, they obeyed God immediately. And because the Magi obeyed, they protected baby Jesus. They bypassed danger because the angel actually led them to safety. And they became part of God's unfolding plan in history. Church family, I want us all to hear this. The guidance of God always comes with the protection of God. I know that when God tells us to do something, it sounds really difficult. And many times, and I'm not going to lie to you, many times following God is difficult. But I will tell you one thing. While obedience may not be easy, obedience always leads to life that God gives you, not the life that this world can ever give. And so I want to show us two different paths. When you look at this story as a whole in Matthew chapter 2, it becomes glaringly obvious. Herod and the Magi are both standing in the same crossroads. They both received the same news. They both shared the same moment in history, same baby, same city. But their responses take them in a completely different path, completely opposite directions. Herod chose to live in the path of fear. The Magi, on the other hand, chose to live the path of faith. And in doing so, Herod destroys everything in his path, but the Magi worship a baby that they had never known before. Herod clings on to control. The Magi surrender their control. Herod tries to protect his own kingdom. The Magi actually becomes part of God's unfolding kingdom. And Herod ends his life in violence and tragedy of the killing of thousands of innocent babies, but the Magi end their lives in joy and transformation. This passage that we looked at is deeply theological. It's also very personal to you and I, because every single one of us here in this room today, right now, we have the choice to choose one of these two different paths. Choosing to live in fear or choosing to live in obedience. And I want to end today's sermon with the good news of Christmas and the season of Advent. Here's the good news. This baby, Jesus, who Herod feared so much for, this baby would grow up into the king who conquers all of our fears. Jesus did not lead like Herod. Jesus does not rule his kingdom by intimidation and threatening. Jesus does not destroy everything in his path. Actually, counterculturally, Jesus actually restores. He heals people. He invites people to his kingdom, the worst of the worst. And Jesus, he saves, not destroys. Herod was willing to kill and destroy to stay on his personal throne. But Jesus was willing to get off of his own throne in heaven and die in order that you and I would be invited into God's kingdom. What a juxtaposition. Herod brings pain into the world, but Jesus brings peace because he's the Prince of Peace of this world. And while Herod's kingdom creates fear, doubt, and uncertainty, Jesus' kingdom brings peace and joy by breaking our fears. Herod's throne finally was shaky at best, and it only lasted 33 years. Jesus' throne is eternal. Praise be to God. The good news of Christmas is that you don't have to live in fear like Herod did. You don't have to. You are offered a life of peace under this Prince of Peace. And Herod and the Magi show us that two paths lay in front of every human heart here. Fear or faith, control or surrender, destruction or worship, our own little kingdoms versus God's eternal kingdom. And today, right now, you get to choose which path you want to take. Like the Magi, you can come to Jesus with open hands. You can bow, worship, listen, and obey to hear his voice. And you will discover, in doing so, you're going to discover this joy and peace that this world cannot offer. And finally, you can experience transformation of your life. Or you can be like Herod, and you can let fear take the lead of your life. But remember this, the only person who loses when fear takes control, it's you. And all the people that are around you that are devastated in your path. So today, ladies and gentlemen, as we enter this season of Advent, on this second week of Advent, Advent is this season of expectation, of hope, of waiting and wonder. So let us, I invite each and every one of you to follow the path of faith like the Magi and not the path of fear like Herod. Let's move toward Jesus this season in faith. Let's bow down to him in worship, and let's obey his voice when he speaks. Let's pray, everyone.